Hello and welcome to Brick by Brick, where we bring together thought leaders from across the industry to discuss the key issues within the property sector. Whilst the government says providing more homes is the most efficient way to level up the country, it has no clear strategy for how to do so. The UK is currently faced with a deficit of 4.75 million homes. So today we're here to discuss the subject of a new Brickflow white paper, solving the UK's housing shortage and the action, not rhetoric, we need to get Britain building. And today I'm joined by three of our report's key contributors. So welcome to Gareth Davies, Head of Business Development for Commercial Lending at Hodge Bank, Adam Tyler from FIBA, and Hugh Gibbs, co-founder of Searchland. Thanks for joining us today. Right, so our first question today is around planning. Our industry often talks about the toxic triangle of the planning system, the land market and insufficient access to funding. Let's start with planning today. How critical is sorting out the planning system to solving our housing crisis? Who wants to take that?
Well, I'll start because it's a very short answer. I mean, the planning system is archaic, if I'm honest with you. I've always believed that we need to modernise planning. I think bringing in some of the private sector would help. I mean, you're leaving it to the local authorities to deal with it, and the local authorities are the local authorities. You bring in the working from home that you've got within the councils at the moment. It does make it very, very difficult. So I think that it does need some modernisation, and let's make use of the private sector. You know, the developers, the contractors, the builders, the people who've actually been there and done it. That'd be great to see them involved in planning. I know it has its difficulties, but that's something we should be definitely considering.
Okay, great. Gareth, what are you hearing on the ground? You're speaking to developers?
Indeed, and I think one of the biggest pieces of feedback that we get from developers is how slow the planning process is, and I agree with Adam that it is.
And is that something
archaic.
that is changing? Is that becoming longer in recent times?
I think one of the main reasons for it taking so long is because it's been underfunded, and it's been underfunded for decades.
Yeah.
And it takes a very long time for pre-apps to get approved. And then subsequently, once it goes through a process, you've then got a section 106 to make sure that the planning consent is actually implementable. And that could take comfortably 2 years. And as we've seen over the last 2 years itself, an awful lot can change. So we've seen massive cost inflation, we've seen huge rises in base rate. And if you start off 2 years ago with a planning application that makes sense, profitable scheme, 2 years down the line when you actually get a consent, it might be unviable to implement. Yeah. So that is a real problem for developers. And it creates an issue where they're lining up funding, they're getting contractors ready for a scheme that may not actually be able to start.
And most lenders won't grant any form of funding until there's full planning permission in place.
Yes, yeah,
so you have this chicken and egg situation, which is very difficult to manage.
What did you say? I mean, it could put a developer under, couldn't it, in terms of their business if they taking an inordinate amount of time, or
if they've just got one scheme on the go. Now, most developers won't. They'll have several in different stages, and that's really important. But what we've seen is because of increases in costs and increase of the cost of finance, developers are actually doing less. And if you then relying on schemes to get through planning, and they can take 2 years plus, it creates a real problem and a real blockage.
Yeah. I mean, I won't mention it in detail now, but I'm a big supporter of the small house builder, the one who builds 2, 3, 4 houses, and they're the ones that are really, really badly affected by planning. It's okay for the larger ones, maybe even the ones that've got 2 or 3 schemes, but the small house builders, which are the lifeblood of the development industry, they're really struggling with the planning rules at the moment.
I think that's right. The planning process is very much guided towards the larger national house builders, and they can buy in resource to deal with it and navigate what is a very difficult system. And the smaller house builder just simply doesn't have the resource all the time to deal with that.
I think that's a good point, is that if the government are really trying to push the brownfield developments, which are too small really for the bigger house builders, the smaller house builders need more help, right? They haven't got the resource, both financially and time-wise, to wait for this.
I think they do. With the brownfield sites that are coming forward, it'd be very useful to understand what is coming forward and to get some transparency into that. But to also understand the potential cost that it would take to potentially demolish or remediate some of those sites, which isn't particularly transparent at the moment, because that can be the difference between whether a development lives or dies, is coming out of the ground. And if the cost to remediate a piece of land are prohibitive to that, again, we've got a potential problem.
Yeah. I want to bring Hugh in. Hugh, didn't you used to work in the planning department?
Yes, firsthand can attest to a lot of this.
Tell us.
So I was a GIS officer, so I made the maps, but I was on the policy team. So I was sort of hands-on with local plan creation, trying to get it into a digital format.
And from the inside, where do you see the problems?
The problems are we rely too heavily on the council. They're positions you go into to stay into. It's very hard for progression, so it's a very stifling environment. Entrepreneurialism and councils are two very different things, or that sort of local government. And there's this whole thing, and we're saying that medium and large developers are much more amenable to longer development timeframes, and that councils cater to that. Well, that just happens to be the case. Councils, the real problem is councils do not put a time value on time or a value on time.
Yeah.
And so they do things in the way that they do it because they have to be bureaucratic, and they're very by the book. Councils are extremely by the book, which is a good thing. There are positives to that. But ultimately, the focus is still on the SME, especially on the S side of the SME. We even talk about people trying to break into development. Yeah. They're really struggling. Yeah. And the delays that come on the back of it, and I can go into more detail on those, but it's not a very prosperous breeding ground, and that sentiment is sort of exploded when you consider that there's over 300 councils, and they're all trying to do things in their own way.
Well, that's what I was going to say. You said about the book, but when the book's different in every borough, it makes it even more challenging, right?
Yeah, exactly. And we'll go on to this, I'm sure, but with, the original question was, does planning need to change? And the idea is, I actually think that it's kind of controversial. It does work. I mean, we've approved over 300,000 homes in a year before under more or less the same system. So it does work. But what we have to do, I think, it's an efficiency problem, which is the focus is, if we had one goal, how do we increase the time to sort of approval with good conditions on there? That needs to be a factor. How do we limit that, break the planning system down into sort of constitute parts, and then look at the efficiencies inside each of those? And there will be solutions with today's system that doesn't require huge reform, just sort of efficiency tweaks.
It's definitely resources. It's resources, and we know that obviously councils claim to be underfunded, and we obviously don't know the ins and outs of all their finances. But it is an underfunded part of the local authority network, I suppose. I mean, I'd love to bring in the repurposing of buildings in our existing high streets and our town centres that also need work, and then you obviously you're not only adding the planning to that, you actually bring in the land registry and the inefficiencies we've got in the land registry at the moment as well. And we know how long it's actually taken to register, new titles and so forth. You add all that into the system, it's very, very hard to achieve what we're trying to achieve, and the numbers of houses we're trying to build. But again, it comes back to money again. It's all back to the funding. And is central government going to say, yeah, we're going to pour billions into the planning system to make house builders richer? It's never going to happen. It's got to come from private enterprise somewhere to do that. So, and we will go on to talk about the levy on house builders and how do we do that without endangering new schemes by imposing too much upfront cost on them.
I think part of the underfunded nature of the planning authorities is it doesn't invest in technology, so they get left behind. So we end up with quite a laborious system that's very much paper driven. But there's a human factor here as well, in the fact that people leave, and they leave to the private sector or they retire. And that's one thing, but with them goes a whole skill set and a whole knowledge base. And that's the bit that's disappearing out of the planning authority.
I think there's also a nice scenario here if we're just going to create like a sort of dream world where, if you took the resources councils do have, could you make that work? And I think that is going to be a technology question. It's going to be a modernization question. Unfortunately, I think it's going to be too difficult to do in a realistic time frame. But it's if there was investment earlier on, I think we would actually be able to see a closer gap that we could sort of segue over to just a more efficient system.
Yeah, it's we could talk about it for days, I'm sure. I think also what comes into it is obviously the life span of a parliament. These are challenges that are too big for anyone to solve in a 5-year parliament. So it just kind of gets kicked down the road every time, doesn't it?
I think one of the real challenges there is actually around the Secretary of State for Housing.
There we go.
And it is a real challenge because it never really hits the top of anyone's manifesto. Housing is always an issue.
Pushing it quite hard at the moment.
They are, but if you look over the last 13 years, we've had 15 different housing ministers. We've only had 5 that have lasted longer than 12 months, and we've had 6 in the last 2 years.
We have, yeah.
Which presents a real issue with consistency, with any kind of backbone to deliver any meaningful change.
Yeah,
I agree. I mean, I've been to 10 Downing Street twice to see housing ministers, to talk about the housing crisis some years ago.
See the same one?
No, it was very different ones. You know, other than having a nice photograph outside number 10, me being there and all the other people representing development finance at the time, we didn't make any difference at all.
Yeah,
we had all our photographs taken about 2 or 3 years apart, but we didn't make any difference because the housing ministers were never the same.
Yeah.
And I do believe that the housing minister doesn't have a seat on the cabinet. I think that is the case. I don't think they actually sit on the housing minister doesn't have a seat on the cabinet. So
it's not given that prominence within government.
It's always been viewed as a much more junior Secretary of State role.
Yeah.
And that's it. It's a stepping stone into health or education or something much more significant.
Okay, guys, right, let's move on to our second question, which is around funding. So to build houses, developers obviously need funding. How successful have government and Homes England schemes like the Enable Build programme and the Housing Accelerator Fund actually been? And are government guarantees the solution?
People are not aware of all the numbers of funders that are out there. If you ask your small property developer or even your larger, medium-sized property developer, have they heard of Hodge Bank? Probably not. No offence, Gareth.
No, I totally agree.
So we don't have this awareness across the UK of all the other schemes that are out there. When the financial crisis came in 2008, we lost 80% of our small house builders because the high street banks just pulled away, weren't interested, and we lost them, and they never really came back. I've lobbied. The best government that listened was Vince Cable during the coalition government as business minister. Those 5 years, great. They listened. I mean, they talked a lot about peer-to-peer lenders. Yep. We had the growth of challenger banks coming through. I could go on and talk about all of the access to finance piece, because obviously that's my hobby horse, but it's a real issue with development finance. It is a real issue making people aware that there are some great lenders out there, like Hodge Bank and others, that can help house builders get the funding that they need. But if they go to their usual sources, the traditional sources, and they say no, they literally really do not know where else to go.
I think that's a really interesting point that Adam's made is whilst we saw the disappearance of a whole collection of SME developers, when we hit the global financial crisis, we also saw the larger clearing banks retrench to a more centralised model. But what that did was open up a whole different area for smaller, second-tier challenger banks, peer-to-peer funders, institutional funds to come in and fund development. But exactly as Adam said, is how do we get those SME developers to know about who we are, but also finding the best relationship, partnership that they can have for that particular development. There's a whole collection of different funders out there in the private sector, but we all do things very slightly different.
Yep.
And whether Hodge is right for one developer may not be so.
Or even one development, right?
Absolutely correct. Yeah. Absolutely correct. We'll have appetite for some, but not for everything. And that is true, say, with experience. We don't fund new developers who don't have any experience. So our appetite is guided towards those who have experience. But does every developer that has experience know about Hodge Bank? No chance.
No, they don't. And they've got to start somewhere. So even if it's converting a normal residential house into perhaps an HMO, that's a form of development. That gets them started. Yeah. You know, development isn't always necessarily ground up. I mean, it's, as we've already talked about, repurposing other buildings. So there are a whole raft. I mean, there's actually 400 lenders to business across the whole of the UK. I mean, you ask most people, they couldn't probably name more than a dozen. They really couldn't, most people in business.
And so 5 of them would be high street banks.
Exactly. So how do we use technology in that? I mean, obviously I represent the intermediary industry. We're very lucky in UK that we actually have something called commercial finance brokers. Commercial finance brokers sit between this whole raft of lenders and small business or small developers. That is only replicated in the US and Australia. There's nowhere else in the world has this resource that we have. And I've obviously, having spent 18 years lobbying on behalf of these guys, obviously, it is, again, it's another one of my hobby horses. But if a developer finds the right kind of intermediary, you can say, well, perhaps it's not Hodge Bank for you, it's XYZ. Then the whole thing works, because once they've done one development, they're back to the Gareth for the next one. So it again, what we need to do is make people more aware that this actually is available to them, this resource of all these different lenders, because if one doesn't fit, then another one may well do.
Well, and also I think just make it easy to get quick answers, right? Everyone hates a slow no.
Yes.
So if you can quickly go to lenders and ascertain what the borrowing terms are, then that just speeds everything up. It's probably a technology solution out there somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, this seems like one of those nice problems where there's a solution out there. It's a marketing thing.
I mean, development finance is full of formulas. I mean, there are formulas. I mean, it's more difficult if you're actually funding a commercial mortgage when you can look at the affordability of a trading business. But development finance does have sort of calculations to it. So you know that it's a percentage of GDV that they'll lend. You know it's a percentage of the construction cost. You know it's a percentage of the purchase price of the land or whatever it is. So you can actually formalize this thing to make it actually
A lot
work.
of that is not published though. I think that's the
That's
difficulty.
the difficulty.
And obviously it's, it varies so much from lender to lender.
The other bit there is I think there is an absolute advantage to using technology for raising awareness. The challenge with development, it is not quite as mathematically focused as investment, and there are very different risks involved with
There is certainly more
two
objectivity,
developments that look
subjectivity
very
to it.
similar, but could have fundamentally different risks.
Yeah.
So a human interaction on development finance, I think, is really important.
Yeah, I think you wouldn't get a deal through to completion without having a human involved.
Agreed, yeah.
You need to have a human involved somewhere. But you have the technology at the start to actually hone it down where it needs to go.
Absolutely.
So continuing on the theme of technology and innovation, in addition to funding, what other areas of the property sector do we need to digitise, and how can we encourage more investment in technology across the sector to facilitate more house building?
So alternative to finance, planning and policy is my go-to always. Other people say otherwise. It's one of the interesting ones where if you look at part of the problem, and it's anecdotal, but it rings true for everyone, which is one application could have two different decisions if there's two different case officers. That's a huge problem. Like we shouldn't exist in a planning policy environment where that's the case.
Yep.
And I'm really anti sort of silver bullet, big drastic changes, whole scale changes, because they come with their own suite of problems, especially when you're talking about reinstitutionalizing a system. But one of the things that I would like to see is a methodology of grading every parcel of land. I don't know whether it's on per land ownership records as per, say, land registry, because that's a good realistic ground, like someone owns this, or if it's on a more geospatial element. There's something called I think it's the 6-hex grid, which is a fantastic spatial modeling. I think there is a scenario where you could take planning policy. Is it in the green belt? Is it in the city? Is it in the limits to the built developments of assessment boundary? Is it brownfield, greenfield? All the policies that are known, they're all spatial, and grade them. And every site could have quite a simple score, up to 10, up to 100. And then you have a finger in the air exercise. And I think that we're not a million miles from there. I just think it's a very different way of doing what we do already. So data could, in theory, do that. You can still allow for a degree of tolerance. You could still have a sort of 20%, 25% case officer allowance to apply additional weight to policies and things like that. But I would like to see more transparency. I'm not in a rush to see it. I think solutions already exist. Again, I actually think it's a really easy problem to solve financially from the government. I think they need to take a step back and do a bit of an enabling. I've seen what they can do, and they are probably 15 years behind what the private sector is doing. Their biggest example, not to drag them through it, but they released policy maps for the UK. Got all the media attention. Everyone was very excited. It was sort of ushering in the era of digitalizing the planning system. It was just a series of constraint maps that we've already had access to forever. And It's like, great, if this is the starting point, like the private sector is way ahead. Like, just stop and let us take over. It's free. but you do need to enable it in a way that sort of helps.
I think anything that could bring forward some element of consistency and some element of assurance that developers will actually get a planning consent at the back end. Bearing in mind these things are really, really expensive to obtain. If you can get some kind of comfort that they will achieve a planning consent at the back end, however you go about doing it. But I think some form of technology to make things simpler for people to understand and visualize more easily will be a big step forward.
So what do we think of, I think 28% of applications are refused, residential. That's across the country. It varies wildly council to council. I don't know what to make of the statistics as to whether they're good or bad, because it's really, do you still hit the sort of 300,000 approvals? Would be like a good finger in the air. So that number is what it is, 28% get refused. If you look at appeals, 30% of appeals get allowed.
Right.
That number blows my mind, because it's like, how has someone got to get a rejection, then go through the appeal process, which is not quick, and can be extremely costly for the council, and have it approved in the first place. Like the fact that the appeal rate has always been about 30% shows that there has been a constant failure.
A failure,
That's not
Is
so
that
much.
not 9,000 if you're saying that money?
Yeah.
Or 9%, sorry,
9%,
getting reinstated.
So that's my take on it. You can have as many refusals as you want, because you can have really bullish applications, but the sort of canary in the coal mine is those appeals data.
But what about using technology as a data bank for land that's available or buildings that are available? Because if you're a small-time property developer, it's very hard to source land. It's very difficult to source land. A lot of land, exchanges between people who know somebody because it's a referral. It's very hard to identify a piece of land you can actually go and buy as a small first-time developer.
Well, that's actually something we're just about to come on to. So if we take land supply or lack thereof, which 2/3 of SME house builders claim is a barrier to building, we know that transparency of land market data is poor, but some argue that finding land for developers is actually relatively easy and simply being used as a smokescreen. So what is the truth?
I disagree
who's on the right
completely.
side?
I disagree completely. I mean, as a small time, I mean, I have developed in the past, a long time ago, but as a small time developer, they struggle to find the right kind of land to build on.
That's the key.
That's the key to it.
It's not just about finding land. It's about finding land that is developable at a cost that will generate a profit.
I think that's the key thing, is it? It's the right price.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's shifted materially over the last couple of years, particularly with brownfield sites being brought forward. The costs of some of the remediation have now become very, very high and would ultimately prohibit them being developed.
And now throw into the mix cost of funding increasing. So land prices need to fall. We're in that transition phase where landowners still don't want to accept their land is worth less.
I mean, I'll give you a real life example. I mean, we funded something recently. We funded it. It was purchased. The developer put their own money into it. They spent £70,000. It's a relatively small development, but £70,000 into it. The valuer came in 6 months later, valued it exactly as it would have been on a flat site with nothing on it at all.
Right. Yeah.
And that's just where we've gone with the values. The GDV wasn't too bad. The gross development value at the end of it wasn't too far off what we'd expect when it's finished. But the valuers were very, very concerned about enhancing the value other than what it would have been as just a pure greenfield site.
So that's that what they call that hope value. Yeah. A little bit extra on there.
So you have the valuers now obviously being very concerned about what they're putting down as the value at the outset, never mind what they're putting down as a GDV at the end of it as well. So,
yeah, I think GDV is obviously exceptionally difficult. I really do sympathise with surveyors at the moment. I think it's an exceptionally difficult market to navigate. But then when you throw in uncertainty around cost of finance and build costs, I mean, they are still going up, albeit at a slower rate. As you touched on earlier, Gareth, you got something that 2 years ago you bought and it looked like it was an absolute belter of a scheme, and then you get dragged through a really painful planning process and the economic environment has changed full circle and all of a sudden it's no longer viable.
The speed that things have changed is a real problem. So in years gone by, changes that we've seen in 18 months would have taken potentially decades to get to, particularly on the change in base rate, which is 5,000% where it used to be only 18 months. So it's a huge shift, and we're starting to see average house prices now come down. And typically what you'll see is land prices should come down when average house prices come down. But at the moment we're not seeing that, and there's going to be a lag because of the speed that this has happened.
Yeah.
But at the same time, because the underlying dynamics of housing are so skewed between demand and supply, it almost keeps the land prices up. So there's going to be a demand for it. Yeah. And that's quite a difficult circle to extricate ourselves from.
And nowadays, I mean, it'd be very difficult to build to let, because obviously the buy to let market is in a very different place from where it was previously. There is a tendency for people now to look at multi-unit blocks. So you'll have a single developer that will build the block, 6 flats, all their separate leaseholds. He'll own the lot and obviously let them out. There is a tendency to do that now, because it's more, as you can get a high yield from that than you would obviously just the traditional property. So there's lots of different things that are actually happening because the market will adapt. The market will adapt. I mean, we can look at focus on all the negatives, but there's a lot of adaptation, and the development finance market is very adaptable.
And on the platform, Hugh, how do you see sort of land supply constraints? Is that something you can pull data on?
When you say constraints, we're talking policy designation constraints and what's actually available?
Yeah, available land, exactly.
Yeah, well, I actually wanted to go back to this point. It's a really important aspect, is this perception. Now, I've never developed myself, and I've never been in the process of a bidding war. So I've only using my anecdotal evidence between people, but there's a perception that when a site goes to market, it's very difficult to make it stack. And I have to believe that because there's imperfect information, because people don't really know what the base rates are, because they don't know what the build costs are going to be, they kind of have a bit of an optimistic view, which means that they can take that optimism and they can put it on the land and they can bid the price up. So there's this view that when you actually make land available on the market, it's it usually doesn't stack, and what you get left with is it was sometimes a development that doesn't work, or it's a development you've had to cut costs on to make it
substandard
work. And affordable housing is often the one to suffer on the back of that. That's a long, well-known sort of pattern. On the platform is more about the promotion of off-market. Now, this is something that I think SMEs should all be involved in. It is inherently entrepreneurial. It is saying, hey, I don't need to know what's on the market. I'm going to go and create a deal. I'm going to bring a deal up. And it's about assessing, it's about wearing a planning hat, it's about wearing, sort of development hat, and just really understanding the site, saying, I like this site, I'm going to go approach the landowner, I'm going to make them a fair offer, and I'm going to negotiate with them. And that way of going off market is where we're seeing more land supply come towards it. So it's a different avenue, it's a different approach, and it does work. And unsurprisingly, or surprisingly, it works off the back of letters. You write a letter to the landowner from land registry, which, isn't super fit for purpose for being up to date, right on time, and when things are changing, but it is advanced compared to other countries in terms of what they have. I mean, just go north of the border to Scotland and deal with Scotland's. They're less than, I think, 50% coverage of register, and it's very hard to sort of access information. So, the on-market land is a sort of touchy subject for developers, I've found. Off-market's time-consuming, but is a route to sort of building your own deals.
So, okay, great. Thanks, guys. Thanks for that feedback. And to close, what recommendations would each of you make if you were in a room with somebody from government, be that Mr. Sunak or Mr. Gove, or whoever the housing minister is at the moment? Who would, what would your recommendation be to them in terms of addressing this chronic undersupply? One from each?
It's very simple for me. Raise the status of the housing minister. Put somebody in post and say, you're in that post for 5 years. If you want to take that post, you're in that post for 5 years. You've got to see it in the cabinet. And then we'll get the consistency, because we'll all know where to go then, whether we're developers, whether we're lenders, whoever we are. We'll have one individual that we can actually focus on in the same way as we can focus on the Chancellor and say, look, we've got an issue here and this is how we all need to work together. That'd be my one recommendation.
Okay, great.
So for me, I think if we're actually serious about bringing SME developers back to the market, getting them developed again, they need to be provided with an incentive to do so. If we take a general rule of thumb 2 years ago, you typically expect to see a 20% profit on cost. That same deal today would probably generate maybe 12 or 13% profit on cost. Well, if you are, if you consider that you could probably get 6% on a bond, why would a developer risk everything for an extra 6 or 7%? It's just not worth it at the moment. So they need proper incentives to get them building it.
Is that in the form of grants?
How you go about it, that's a whole bigger debate. And potentially some kind of tax breaks. Anything that would really encourage proper investment and get them off the ground developing again.
Interesting. Hugh?
Mine's it's a sort of two-parter. It's one is modernizing the sort of planning policy and data system. That is the umbrella that all developers are sitting under, is they have to interface with planning. And I think standardizing the system would be, quite frankly, not that hard to come up with a set of rules to do. I think it'd be a massive pain in the ass to actually implement. So that's things like applications or a policy reading in the southeast as it should in the northeast. It's an application being called an outline, being registered as an outline in the southeast as it is in the northeast. It's about making the data available as well. So spatially, raw downloads, it should be public data, and it should be available to everyone. I think if they have a system of standardizing information and making it publicly available, the private sector will do what it does best and just run with it. I think at that point, they can then start to sort of devolve some of their responsibilities to the right private sector, whether it's the industry, and they can either choose to do it by hedging their bets on some front runners, which they're kind of doing now. They are investing in it, not massive amounts, or just allowing the sort of industry to sort of solve the problem naturally. This side of it can be outsourced to the free market. Developers will pay if private sector solve problems. And I think if we have better data to work with, that would be the first start, and then build a platform that we can begin to do other things with that are a bit more interesting.
Open planning.
Open planning, yeah, that's exactly it.
We can all feed into the API. So a big thank you to Adam Tyler from FIBA, Gareth Davies from Hodge Bank, and Hugh Gibbs from Searchland for joining us for this episode of Brick by Brick. If you'd like to know more, download the Brickflow white paper, Solving the UK's Housing Shortage, at brickflow.com.